This is the marionette part of the exhibit, which looks at puppets that use strings for controls. One of the things that we tried to play with in this exhibit is thinking about what are the different sort of iterations and variations around puppet form, and what are the implications of that? Like what changes if you're using a puppet that's suspended from above versus a puppet that you come at from below or relate to differently. And so marionettes are particularly interesting as a form, and they're perhaps the form that we think of most quintessentially if we think about a puppet being controlled by something, right? The sort of puppet master idea of puppets. But marionettes are quite sort of paradoxical in that regard, because on the one hand, they suggest this idea of an object that's really been controlled completely by somebody else. The strings are dictating all the movements of the puppet. But at the same time, they're perhaps one of the puppets that express the most kind of life of their own. They have a kind of freedom of movement because they sway and they're suspended in gravity. So there's this tension in marionettes between this idea of control and freedom. They really highlight for us through that form just the kind of what it means to be alive in gravity. What does it mean to have a body with mass, a body that's responsive to its environment, that's somehow related to another form that may be animating it, but also is suggesting something of its own dynamics, is somehow expressing a kind of freedom of movement within gravity. So I think they're particularly interesting in that regard. So one of the things that's interesting about the form of puppets and really thinking about that form all the way from making a puppet all the way to figuring out how it works and sort of getting a feel for its movements, and then all the way to performance, is that all those things are related, but every step of the way you learn something new about those. And I think we oftentimes think of that as a kind of sequence. You make something, you figure it out, and then you do something with it. But I think in working with puppets and marionettes in particular, you really get a feel for how all those things cycle through in many different ways. So how you want the puppet to perform is also going to dictate how you make the puppet and what kinds of movements are available in the puppet and what kinds of gestures or expression or what kind of mood do you want to express through the puppets. And so when you're making it, you have to keep all those things in mind. But then in the process of making it, you discover something new about that. What does it mean for a movement to express something? And how do you translate that into the materiality of a puppet? And then as you try to figure out what that looks like as you're making the puppet, that gives you new ideas of what's possible. And this is particularly, I think, true with marionettes because you can have an idea of what the movement's going to look like, but until you string it up, until you try it, it's unclear how that's gonna express. And so there's a lot of speculation, a lot of surprise, a lot of wonder that comes throughout that process. One of the things that was really interesting about this exhibit is it started from an archive and started from discovering this history of puppetry in education that exists in these texts that are not necessarily read anymore. And so what does it mean to go back to that archive and look back at these materials and think about that early history? And um, so of course, once we realized that there was this wealth of material, it seemed like we had to find a way to understand something about what that material was and how we could orient to it and bring it into our own sort of present in a dynamic way that would allow us to kind of think through what it might mean to us today. And so this is also part of a larger project where we've been really thinking about what does reading look like in the digital age? What does reading look like when people have less time to read, when people are less inclined to read longer texts? And so we've been playing with thinking about collective ways to read together in the digital age. And so we've been playing with all these different forms of a reading group itself as a way to kind of think through the social and technical apparatus through which we read, right? Reading is never just on its own, but it's always in relationship to books. It's always relationship. Those books are in relationship to other books. Those books may be talking about plays or puppet theater or whatever it is. So every book that we read is somehow connected to a larger articulated form. This sort of like meta puppet through which we explore ideas together. Right. And so I think one of the things that's really great about having the reading group is it gives us a place to explore those ideas about puppets, but also think about the mediums of our learning themselves and how we structure those in order to allow certain freedoms and certain constraints. And what do we get out of those combinations? As part of the puppet reading group, it's part of a larger project to think about the form of reading groups today. And so we've created a kind of platform for exploring different kinds of reading, which is called Open Practices. And so if anyone's interested in participating in, if they're excited by the idea of puppetry, they can go to openpractices.org, and there's an opportunity for you to join in the reading group. All these reading groups are open to contributors and participants from all walks of life, and you'd be more than welcome to join. Open Practices as a kind of loose holder for thinking about how we can read and engage with these different ideas is about taking them on to see what emerges. So one of the things that's really interesting is that puppets in education have a long history, and the archive that was the beginning of this exhibit really goes back to the 20s, where this idea of puppetry and pedagogy were all of a sudden sort of confronting each other. And what does it mean to introduce puppets into education? And today, of course, we almost take it for granted, right? That of course, of course, puppets would be a great way to talk to kids or to deliver a message to kids. And we have a long history now of thinking about puppets as educational devices, particularly in the media. So we think about Sesame Street or Mr. Rogers, or all these ways in which puppets were really central to the idea of thinking about education as a kind of mediated experience. And yet, in a weird kind of way, we're so used to thinking about puppets in education that we actually have a hard time thinking about what is that as a choice. Why puppets in education? If it weren't puppets, what would we be doing differently? And so, in a weird kind of way, like the idea of exploring the relationship between puppets and education isn't just how do we use puppets for educational purposes, but when we look at puppets, what does that tell us about how we engage in education in the first place? One of the things I really enjoy about this exhibit, and honestly, really the whole process of putting together this exhibit is well, let me say two things actually. One is that when we take this on as an open question, it becomes a really interesting way to organize a community of inquiry around something and really play through lots of different iterations of what that can look like. And to me, this is really inspiring as a way to think about what education can look like. That it's not just restricted to something that happens in the classroom, but it's a way of collectively taking on questions and exploring it through its material iterations with people who are interested in exploring that together.